Creator, may your spirit and guidance be in us as we work for the benefit of all our people, for peace and justice in our land, and for the constant recognition of the dignity and aspirations of those whom we serve. Amen.
Amen.
Hi, good afternoon. I do Minister a statement. Minister of Health and Social Service must see
children and youth receiving services and care from Child and Family Services. The Auditor General's report contains findings that are disappointing and concerning to all of us. While these findings align with what we have seen in our own internal audit, they are difficult and serve as another reminder that we are not where we need or want to be, and we must do better. The Department of Health and Social Services and I have reviewed and accepted without question all 11 recommendations in the report. And I want to assure you that we take these findings and recommendations very seriously. We have already started implementing actions to fix the issues identified through this audit and our own internal audit. We also recognize that there is more that must be done. Mr. Speaker, before outlining the actions we are taking, it is important to remember the actions that we took following the previous report of the Auditor General's released in 2014. Members will recall that we created the Building Stronger Families Action Plan 4 years ago to transform Child and Family Services. Under this plan, we took a number of actions to better serve and support children, young people, and their families in the Northwest Territories. We amended the Child and Family Services Act to help mature youth make the successful transition from care to living independently. We improved training for staff, implemented a new Child and Family Services information system and structured decision-making tools, updated the Standards and Procedures Manual, and got advice on how to better assess and manage caseloads so that we can better support our staff in their work. We set up an internal auditing process, tabled legislated annual reports by the Child and Family Services Director, and appointed a Chief Operating Officers as Assistant Directors so that we can be more accountable for our work. We also increased rates for foster parents to provide them with better financial support. Mr. Speaker, the steps we have been taking are the right ones, and they are the foundation stones needed to create a better outcomes for children and their families. However, the Auditor General has concluded that some of the changes that we have been making to the system have not been effectively implemented. Mr. Speaker, these audits show us that while we've been doing the right things, we need to be more focused on doing things the right way. As I have acknowledged for some time, there's more to be done to improve Child and Family Services. Reflected on these findings, we will be moving ahead with an improved focus on how we are managing and resourcing changes that we must continue to make. Mr. Speaker, in January of this year, I attended meetings hosted by Minister Philpott regarding the crisis of Indigenous children and youth in care in Canada. At this meeting, we heard from Indigenous leaders from across the country regarding the need to create a child welfare system that is more focused on prevention and keeping children and their families with their own families and in their own communities and cultures. I'm proud that these are the things that we here in this Legislative Assembly realized and have been working on for some time. The Director's report that I tabled here last week showed some of the trends that represented the kind of change that we want to see in the child protection in the Northwest Territories and indeed within our country. More children and youth receiving services are remaining in the care of their parents, while the proportion of children being removed from their homes and communities is decreasing. The number of children and families receiving prevention services is rising, while the number of those receiving protection services is falling. More families who are facing challenges in caring for their children are being helped through voluntary service agreements. The number of children in permanent custody of the Director has decreased by over 37%, 244 children to 152 since 2008-2009. Mr. Speaker, while these are hopeful, promising trends, they do not diminish the importance of responding to the findings contained within the Auditor General's report. I want to share with members and the public what we are doing as a system to ensure that we move forward clearly and decisively from this audit and our internal audits. We have begun taking action in 4 areas to fix the system and address the issues identified by the Auditor General. 1, continuing to build a culture of quality. 2, investing in human resources. 3, building staff capacity. And 4, engaging with our partners. First, we need to build on the work we have already started creating a culture of quality. That is why, in the spring, we implemented the Child and Family Services Coordinating Team to collectively plan and address findings from our internal audits. We are also going to launch a System Quality Steering Committee to create a stronger quality improvement culture. Quality assurance processes that were developed by the Northwest Territories Health and Social Services Authority are now being implemented across the territory to enhance key indicator monitoring and reporting, provide feedback to the regions and staff, and support quality improvement planning. In addition, we are upgrading standards in the areas where there is still gaps in quality, such as permanency planning, foster care, as well as investigations. Second, we are focusing on human resources to make sure that we have the right people in the right roles to meet the demand now and into the future. We are assessing caseloads and workloads and stepping up recruitment, retention, and development of child and family services staff. We will be proposing the establishment of new frontline positions and examining whether we should include new roles such as family support workers to improve prevention services as well as early intervention. Positions to better support the screening and review of foster homes have been assigned and will be recruited this year. The out-of-territory program is currently under review in order to ensure that we have proper completed complement of staff to effectively manage and support this program. Third, we are building on the capacity of our child and family services staff. We've made sure that we have core funding they need, including enhancing training and structured decision-making tools, and created an internal training team. We also know we need to improve our training for assistant directors, so we will be delivering the new training program for them later this year. Finally, we are engaging with our partners and drawing on their knowledge to improve outcomes. We are continuing meetings and engagement with staff, started several months ago, to discuss quality issues and get their input on actions required to improve compliance. We are also working with Indigenous communities and leaders to continue to develop more culturally responsive approaches. We are also working with the Foster Family Coalition to strengthen our relationship with foster families and engage them to understand the training and support required to better serve children under their care. Mr. Speaker, as I said, we have laid the building blocks to improve the quality of child and family services for children, youth, and families. But it is clear we continue to face significant challenges, and there is much work we must and will do. As part of our ongoing commitment to quality improvement, we will continue working with members here, our staff, stakeholders, communities, Indigenous leaders, and of course, the families we serve, to make the changes needed for stronger child and family services system here in the Northwest Territories. Our work with our partners must continue to strengthen the child and family services system, making sure it is child, youth, and family focused, and focused on providing high quality care and support in a way that respects culture. We will continue working in partnership with Indigenous communities and leaders to meet the government's commitment in response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to transform child and family services in a direction of a more collaborative and family-centered approach. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Office of the Auditor General of Canada for their insight and for their contribution to improving services for children. I also want to thank all of our child and family services staff who work incredibly hard in extremely difficult and complex situations. We are committed to working with them in partnership and support them in their quest to provide the best services possible to ensure children, youth, and families are protected and supported. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Minister statement. Minister Ike Godani, the Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we are continuing with our mandate commitment to implement the Education Renewal and Innovation Framework and Action Plan. I'm pleased to report that the education system is improving to meet the needs of students, educators, and families of the Northwest Territories. We're at the midpoint of our 10-year strategy, and we're seeing numerous successes and further opportunities for action. Mr. Speaker, there are many challenges in delivering education in the Northwest Territories. We are taking a Made in the North approach, recognizing the unique nature of the communities our schools serve with their many languages and cultures, their small size and remoteness, as well as the legacy of residential schools. Our initiatives and strategies form a continuum of learning and training. Each of them builds upon and complements the others. Our initiatives and our challenges start with the early childhood level. We have more work to do to address the issues emerging from the Early Development Instrument, or the EDI. The EDI is a population-level tool that reliably assesses the developmental health, skills, and behavior of children at the age of developmental transition from early childhood to school age. We have not been surprised at the rates of vulnerability identified in the Northwest Territories since the baseline was established in 2014. However, we are seeing some promising results with those communities that have early childhood learning programs through licensed daycares and day homes, and from those running the junior kindergarten program. We will continue to administer the EDI and the MDI, which is the Middle Years Developmental Instrument, because they highlight gaps that we need to address. We now have actions in place to address each of the domains covered by the EDI. In the EDI domain of physical health and well-being, we provide funding and nutritional advice to all schools in the Northwest Territories through the Healthy Foods for Learning program. We are addressing the domains of social competence and communication skills and general knowledge through our junior kindergarten and kindergarten classrooms with exploration, group work, and inquiry-based learning. We are giving parents and caregivers consistent information and resources to help with language and cognitive development, which is also furthered in our classrooms. We are exploring self-regulation techniques and funding resources for self-regulation in all of our classrooms, starting in junior kindergarten, to assist with emotional maturity and behavior. We will continue to share EDI data with health and social services, and we will continue to work with them on initiatives now underway or in development through the Early Childhood Development Strategy in order to close gaps and meet our ongoing challenges. Mr. Speaker, under the banner of education renewal and also in partnership with Health and Social Services, the Child and Youth Care Counselors Initiative is underway in the Clecho and Decho regions. This initiative gives youth, both students in schools and those who may not be attending, access to mental health counselors. As well, we have contracted a traveling team of mental health counselors to visit the smaller communities in these two regions to ensure that they are also served. This is a critically important initiative. Many of the requests we get for support from our educators concern mental health needs of children and youth. The High School Pathways Initiative is also under development, with comprehensive engagements planned and piloting beginning in the 2019-20 school year. The renewed High School Pathways model aims to ensure that high school students and their parents are better informed about and prepared for high school. Through the Pathways approach, we expect students will be more engaged in their learning, as each student's pathway will be designed to emphasize their competencies and their skills. We hope this approach will help improve student attendance and lead to fewer students dropping out. Communications and career planning tools are also being developed to make sure our students are better prepared for the world after completing high school. Students are also made aware of the history and legacy of residential schools through our Northern Studies 10, which is a mandatory requirement for students to graduate. Every year at the New to the North Educators Conference, new teachers are also offered training to understand the complex and difficult history and legacy of the residential school system in the Northwest Territories. We've made that same training available across the government to the Northwest Territories and at the municipal level, and we have also had other Canadian jurisdictions participate. Mr. Speaker, it's important that all teachers and students moving through the education system understand the impact residential schools has had on generations of Northerners. Many of our students communities are still dealing with and healing from the effects of residential schools that had on individuals and families. The legacy is complex and very personal and manifests in many ways. This is why we embedded the program into the education system. As Justice Murray Sinclair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission stated, there can be no reconciliation without education. One of the most successful initiatives of education renewal, Northern Distance Learning, has expanded to 11 communities this year. This program offers students access to academic level courses not regularly offered in their community school. Since 2015, 45 students have taken at least one course, and some as many as 10 through the Northern Distance Learning excuse me, and have graduated. I cannot emphasize enough how delighted I am that students are able to graduate in their home communities prepared to enter a post-secondary program of their choice. Mr. Speaker, we're also taking steps to ensure the safety of students and staff. This is why we're revising the school funding framework to provide resources to ensure no less than 2 full-time teaching positions are allocated to each school. This change impacts our smallest schools in Sax Harbor, Jean Marie River, Kakiza, Nahanibut, Wrigley, and Wekwiti, which up till now have only been allocated funding for 1 teacher position only. Although this may have been sufficient in the past, an increased focus on physical safety, mental health, and student and teacher supports has highlighted the need for this change. In order to capture our successes and challenges of the whole system change beginning this year, the Department will be undertaking a formal evaluation of education renewal. The report will be released during the next fiscal year. Mr. Speaker, there are tremendous changes taking place in education in the Northwest Territories. We've been describing education renewal as a holistic systems shift. There is no single initiative that will provide the critical change required to meet the needs of the 21st century learners and those that teach them. It is a sum of all the parts. Through all of these changes and initiatives, we are building a more responsive system to address the ongoing challenges of students dropping out of school, attendance, wellness, readiness, competency, and opportunity. While we are certainly seeing some successes, I intend to make sure we continue to innovate and adapt to address to the needs of our students and our educators. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Minister statement. Minister Ikegodanide, Minister Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Speaker, the sustainability and growth of the N.W.T economy requires strategic investment and diversification. The mandate we set for our 18th Legislative Assembly highlights the importance of investing in renewable resources, agriculture, arts, fisheries, forestry, manufacturing, tourism, traditional harvesting, and the knowledge economy. The foundation of much of this work was set out in the 2014 N.W.T Economic Opportunity Strategy, with its goal to establish an environment in which N.W.T businesses and entrepreneurs can take the lead in identifying, pursuing, and realizing economic opportunities. In addition to providing individual livelihoods and jobs, these opportunities will contribute to the grassroots growth and diversity we need to maintain our territory's overall economic health and sustainability. Mr. Speaker, in the coming weeks, I will be releasing a progress and performance measures report on the Northwest Territories Economic Opportunity Strategy. Of the 117 recommendations included in a 10-year plan, almost all have now been actioned or completed. Many were directly incorporated into our government's mandate. Thanks to performance measures laid out in the strategy, Mr. Speaker, we can say with assurance that our investments in diversity are already helping our economy to moderate what has been a tough times in commodity markets. As the results of our investment initiatives take hold, they're also confirming that our mandate is meeting the economic goals and objectives set out by our Legislative Assembly. Today, I'd like to share and celebrate some notable successes. We have seen growth in almost every one of our renewable resource sectors over 4 years of investment. It is no surprise that this growth has been led by our booming tourism sector. Investments in marketing, tourism facilities, parks infrastructure, training, and various local operator supports have helped drive tourism to new levels. Since 2014, every indicator has improved. Visitor spending is up 37%, 30% more people have visited, 28% more tourist licenses were issued. It means our approach is working, that our strategic investments are having a tangible impact across the board. Mr. Speaker, I seek unanimous consent to conclude our minister's statement.
Merci. You got the minister's statement. Now that's it. As in such a go, I mean, you can anyone. But you can anyone. Minister, Industry, Tourism, Investment.
The arts sector has also surged with the 78% growth in its artists registered through the Northwest Territories Arts Program. Registered film and media practitioners in particular have increased by more than 150%. They are contributing to the film industry, now worth around $6.7 million, a 38% increase spurred in part by an investment plan recommended by the strategy. In the center of our commercial fishery is also on the upswing. Compared to 4 years ago, we have issued 27% more commercial vessel licenses. Harvests from our fishers are up by 42%, and they are collecting 55% more of those fish. Those positive results underpin the importance of continuing investment in diversity. We will do so through the strategies and plans that have in place: our agriculture strategy, film strategy, Great Slave Lake fishery revitalization strategy, immigration strategy, and Tourism 2020. We will also be adding to our suite of investment plans with new manufacturing strategy and a renewed approach to supporting and advancing our arts sector. Mr. Speaker, I would like to recognize the Economic Opportunities Strategies Governance Committee, who oversaw the development and implementation of this strategy and who has now fulfilled its mandate. I would like to extend my appreciation on behalf of the Government of Northwest Territories for their guidance. The collaborative approach taken to implement the strategy confirms that all government departments, strategy partners, and stakeholders have a key role to play in developing economic growth and diversity in the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister's statement. Minister, you can go down in the Municipal Community Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Department of Municipal and Community Affairs is working to improve emergency management in the Northwest Territories so that we can better serve communities and help ensure the safety and security of residents. Today, I wish to report progress on the Department of Municipal and Community Affairs efforts to update the Northwest Territories emergency management system, including how government departments work collectively to support communities during emergencies. Communities in the Northwest Territories have experienced natural, technological, and human-caused hazards in the past, and they will continue to do so in the future. Wildfires and floods are of particular concern to the Northwest Territories residents. The risks associated with these hazards are expected to become more frequent and more severe due to climate change. Emergencies can occur at any time and in any place, with or without warning. Improvements in the Northwest Territories emergency management system will help our government keep pace with the changing risk environment and build resilience in our communities to deal with emergencies. Our government committed in the mandate to work with stakeholders to develop and propose amendments to modernize the Civil Emergency Measures Act and to revitalize the Territorial Emergency Response Plan. We have done better than that, Mr. Speaker. With the anticipated passage of the Emergency Management Act at the end of this sitting and a new Territorial Emergency Plan already developed, the Northwest Territories will be well positioned to respond to current and future hazards and threats in the Northwest Territories. The new Act and Plan will also align us better with best practices from across Canada and help clarify roles and responsibilities for communities and the government of the Northwest Territories. Creating an emergency management organization through the new legislation, commonly referred to as an EMO, is an important part of these changes. An EMO will clarify roles and responsibilities for emergency management and focus experience and knowledge in the areas of mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. It will also support capacity building in emergency management and enhance our ability to maintain readiness to respond when a community needs assistance. The EMO, as a centralized point of emergency management issues, will work with key partners to build the relationships of trust, which are so important when faced with major emergencies. The creation of a territorial planning committee will ensure involvement, oversight, and participation in emergency management activities by all departments and other key stakeholders. Over the past several years, community governments have made significant progress in improving their emergency plans and response capabilities. Change to the emergency management legislation builds on this work. They will allow communities more discretion in structuring their emergency plans and programs to reflect their unique operational realities. Community plans will be shared with the emergency management organization to create a more collaborative environment, provide visibility on the level of preparedness in communities, and allow improved planning and prioritization of support efforts in this area. Recent Government of the Northwest Territories participation in the military-led Operation Nanook exercise provided important validation for many elements of the new emergency plan and act. Operation Nanook demonstrated how these two instruments would work together during a major emergency. This exercise also included participation by the community government of Beshiko. I would like to recognize the community government for their excellent work to improve community emergency management capacity. They have set a great example of how our Government of the Northwest Territories and community governments can work collaboratively to ensure the safety and security of our residents. Mr. Speaker, emergency management involves a continual cycle of planning and capacity building to reach and maintain an appropriate level of readiness for emergencies. Having an emergency management organization supported by new legislation will help us to ensure there is a coordinated response to community and territorial emergencies. Masicho, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Minister statements. Minister statements. Member statement. Member for Trinity Willoughby.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today in the House we are bringing attention to the issue of family violence. First off, I'd like to begin by reading the definition of family violence as per Canada Department of Justice website. It reads that family violence is when someone uses abusive behavior to control or harm a member of their family or someone with whom they have an intimate relationship. It may include a single act of violence or a number of acts that form a pattern of abuse. There are many forms of violence, which includes physical, emotional, financial, sexual abuse, as well as neglect. Mr. Speaker, many men have a lot of respect for a woman, whether she is a mother, sister, aunt, or spouse. Over the years, there have been ongoing change within the communities that I represent regarding the perception of violence. Today, men and women are equal, and the people who use violence, whether perpetrated by men and women, are frowned upon by the communities. Mr. Speaker, when I was a child growing up in my hometown, I seen many cases of family violence throughout the community. But today, I am noticing far fewer cases of family violence than has been seen in the past. This is anecdotal evidence, and is also backed up by the various crime statistics in relation to communities I represent. For example, in Fort Resolution, between 2007 and 2016, the violent crimes dropped by 38%, includes Selkirk, 43%. The numbers for Deda and Dilo are included in the Yellowknife stats, which dropped by 5% overall over the same period. At this rate, we can see an end to violence within our lifetime. Mr. Speaker, it is evident that over time people have begun to understand family violence is not acceptable under any circumstance, shape, or form. And I believe that a part of this shift is largely due to the work done by organizations such as the Coalition Against Family Violence, the Status of Women Council, the Native Women's Association, crisis phone lines, the RCMP, and awareness campaigns on family violence, among others. Mr. Speaker, education and awareness drives have become an integral part of reducing rates of family violence in the N.W.T. Mr. Speaker, we must continue to work on ourselves and strive to improve our society and eliminate family violence. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike Godin, Member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, Mr. Speaker, it's Family Violence Awareness Week in the Northwest Territories. That's a time to call attention to the tragedy of family violence and try to take steps to discourage and eventually end it. Family Violence Awareness Week is focused on creating awareness of the problem and promoting a change in attitudes and behaviors. The goal is to address, reduce, and bring an end to family violence. Mr. Speaker, families can be our great source of love, confidence, and trust. When that trust is violated, the consequences for the vulnerable people can be severe. Family violence can manifest in many forms: emotional abuse, neglect, financial abuse, or physical or sexual abuse, and family violence can happen to anyone. Mr. Speaker, in coming to grips with family violence, it's important to understand the cyclical nature of the problem. A simplified view is that hurt people will hurt people. That's a simple phrase, but it contains a lot of layers. It tells us that someone who inflicts family violence was probably the victim of violence at another point in his or her life. It tells us that the best way to resolve current family violence will require trying to fix unhealed wounds of the past. Sometimes those wounds may not even be known by the person who suffered them and who has transformed into the abuser. It's a complex scenario. No wonder solutions are difficult to find. But precisely because of its cyclical nature, Mr. Speaker, we must be relentless in confronting family violence. We know that today's victim of family violence may become tomorrow's perpetrator. We know that today's victim may become tomorrow's statistic. There are a lot of hurt people in the world, Mr. Speaker. They may be hurt from any number of factors: colonialism, residential schools, substance abuse, societal violence, or other causes. Many people need help to heal. At the same time, while we have compassion for past victims, we must be relentless in confronting family violence happening now. We must support frontline workers and provide resources to those taking on this difficult challenge. Mr. Speaker, family violence is not a part of anyone's culture. It is not justified or defensible in any way. Violence should have no place in any family, community, or society. At the appropriate time, I will have questions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike Godin, Member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this week in the N.W.T is Family Violence Awareness Week. This means we should be focused on creating awareness in each of our communities. Our attention should be towards putting an end to family violence. Mr. Speaker, we need to recognize that our communities are working endless hours to create awareness on family violence, and it's everyone's responsibility to support our organizations who are promoting activities to end this violence. I know I don't stand alone, Mr. Speaker, when I say we are supporting programs to raise awareness about family violence. Activities are held in many of our communities to support families who are going through violence in any way, shape, or form. Activities are focused on prevention and awareness. The more we talk about it and the more we education we give, we could be saving lives. So let's get this awareness out and put an end to family violence. We need everyone's support. Mr. Speaker, our efforts about putting an end to family violence means we need to start talking about it and making people realize that this will not be tolerated anymore. talking about standing up for yourselves and not being afraid. Let's start by encouraging culture and traditional events, which includes family members taking part and seeing how much fun it is to do activities together. Mr. Speaker, it is important that our families and our communities know that we support and encourage activities that will make our families stronger. Mr. Speaker, whether we admit it or not, we are all impacted by family violence. This means it's our responsibility to help raise awareness, promote and educate our communities so that family violence will be an open discussion, and families who are affected will not be afraid to come forward and take a stand. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Member statement. Member Ika Godanen, Member Yellowknife Centre.
Mr. Speaker, spousal assault in the Northwest Territories is a social problem of grave proportions. Wives, husbands, and lovers have their eyes blackened, their teeth knocked out, their ribs and legs broken, their bodies bruised, and their lives disfigured by violence as a result of assaults, which occur daily in the Northwest Territories. For many victims, beatings are regular and frequent. Spousal assault strikes at the heart of family and community life. It reaches every part of our society. Many of those who assault were raised in families where spousal assault has taken place. Many of them were themselves abused as children. Many victims of spousal assault saw their mothers beaten by their fathers. Some have grown up to believe that being abused is part of a woman's fate. For too long, the victims of spousal assault and their families have suffered in silence and isolation. This must not be allowed to continue. We must encourage victims to seek help, and when they do, we must be prepared to provide it. Similarly, we must develop methods to deal with the problems of batterers. We must be prepared to do more than impose criminal sanctions through the courts. We must be prepared to reach out to them with counseling, therapy, and family life education. Mr. Speaker, those words are as true today as they were when they were first published in May 1985. The government of the day appointed a 5-member task force to examine the nature and extent of spousal assault, the effectiveness of government responses, and to provide recommendations. Under the chairmanship of the late John Bailey, the task force traveled to 30 communities in the N.W.T. to hear from frontline service providers, victims, and batterers themselves. They came back with more than 100 recommendations. Some of them have been adopted, such as diverting cases away from the courts and providing anger management training. Others still wait for resources. Mr. Speaker, the task force report was dedicated to 3 women for whom its recommendations came too late. 33 years later, the N.W.T. still has the second highest rate of spousal assault in the country. On average, a woman is killed every year, and occasionally a man. The task force is gone and forgotten, but the problem remains. What will it take to reduce and eradicate family violence? Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Member statement. Member Ika Godanen, Member Satu.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, learning and healing while in custody. Mr. Speaker, last year we heard an outcry from the inmates at the North Slave Correctional Centre. Mr. Speaker, on the principles of rehabilitation and reintegration through programs and services, both are essential to building a healthy society and avoid family violence. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Justice during last June's session stated the Correctional Centre offers a wide range of in-house programming, right from curricular activities to treatment healing programs. Mr. Speaker, these services and programs are fundamental to the society's stability and communities. More importantly, reuniting the families once the debt to society is fulfilled. Later, Mr. Speaker, I will have questions to the appropriate minister on the progress and measurements of success. Massey.
Massey. Member statement. Member Ika Godanen, Member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. As this is Family Awareness Week, I will speak on victim services programs of this government offered through the Department of Justice. There are basically three programs: the Victim Assistance Fund, which receives the victims of crime surcharges, which are then used for application-based projects. This program is working well, although there is an opening balance of $260,000 as of April 1st, 2018, as shown in the most recent annual report tabled earlier in this sitting. The second program is the Victims of Crime Emergency Fund, which provides financial assistance to victims of serious violent crime. Although the program has eligibility requirements, there is apparently some discretion for justice officials. I understand that about $40,000 per year is available for the victims of crime. The third program is the network of victim services coordinators that are funded through contribution agreements with the Department of Justice. This system has been in place since 1996, and there are currently 8 community-based victim service coordinators with outreach positions in Hay River and Inuvik dedicated to serving communities without resident victim service providers. These coordinators, other service providers, and volunteers provide victims of crime with information, assistance, support, and referrals to community support services. Support is also supposed to be available to victims of crime in surrounding communities by phone. It is my understanding that the number of service contacts with victims has more than doubled over the last 5 years. Given that this program is delivered through contribution agreements, there appears to be some issues with regard to consistency of support for the coordinators themselves and access to resources to support victims. There is a need for a comprehensive review along with more funding to complete the network and provide victim services in all of our communities. I will have questions for the Minister of Justice on the adequacy of victim services and how this government intends to improve support for the victims of family violence and other crimes. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statements. Member for Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, October 21st to 27th is Family Violence Awareness Week. The focus of this week is to bring awareness to the crisis of family violence in the Northwest Territories, and to that end, I thank all my colleagues on both sides of the floor who've spoken about this issue. I also have to commend the members of the public who are speaking out about their experiences with family violence. I can't imagine it's easy to do so, and I thank them because I know that their words can help others in similar situations. Earlier today, I read a post on Facebook from a resident who, because it is Family Violence Awareness Week, was offering support to others and raising awareness by sharing her experiences. The post was only a few sentences, but it was powerful. There's a line in there that will probably stick with me forever. She said, "The only solution is to leave. I was a jammed clip and 2 seconds away from becoming a statistic. Don't be a statistic." The post generated a lot of positive comments and prompted others to share their experiences. And I have to believe that it gave hope to someone who is in a similar situation. And while I hope that our efforts here today help raise awareness about the crisis of family violence in the N.W.T, the members of this House have the power and responsibility to do more than just raise awareness. Mr. Speaker, I've now twice referred to family violence in the Territory as a crisis. The mandate of this Assembly refers to family violence as a crisis. The statistics that show that the N.W.T has rates of family violence 9 times the national average screams that this is a crisis. Mr. Speaker, it's time that we start mobilizing like we're dealing with a crisis. The member for Yellowknife Centre just spoke about task force recommendations to help address this issue from 33 years ago that still haven't been acted on. At some point, we have to stop patting ourselves on the back for recognizing that this is a crisis and start tackling it head on. I'll have questions for the Minister at the appropriate time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member Eagle-Godin and the member Cam Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Il y a un normes sociaux qui nous touchent tous. Si non, dans notre maison.
If in our house, in our family house, in our friends, this affects somebody, mostly women, but not exclusively. I'm talking about family violence.
complex the issue of family violence is. Even worse, the N.W.T. has the second rate of family violence instances in the country. The situation here in the N.W.T. is at epidemic proportions. Family violence is any instance where a family member is violent, threatening, intimidating, or using any method to elicit fear. Behaviors can include physical abuse, psychological abuse, emotional abuse, financial abuse, forcible confinement, and sexual abuse. It is our duty as legislators, as parents, and as family members to help foster an environment free of fear and free of violence, where the future generations of our children and grandchildren need not suffer in silence, nor live in an environment where abuses, when brought to light, are hushed up and repressed. At 3 years into our term, this year's Family Violence Awareness Week is an appropriate time to reflect on what we have done as Northern leaders to end the crisis of family violence in the Northwest Territories. La Semaine de la Violence Familiale.
The Family Violence Week is an effort of education and cultural information to ensure that the residents of North, what the actions and what's available to help them fight and to overcome these instances of family violence. Thank you, Mr.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike, go down in the member Decho.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, family violence commonly happens in family situations where there is a relationship between two people. What needs to be understood is the personal wellness of individuals caught up in the cycle of violence. Often alcohol is a major contributor to the incidence of violence and the debilitating legacy of intergenerational trauma because of residential schools. Mr. Speaker, family violence rates in the Northwest Territories are appalling and at crisis levels. Therefore, we made it a part of the mandate of the 18th Assembly. In 2013, the Northwest Territories rate of family violence was cited by the Coalition Against Family Violence at 9 to 12 times the provincial average. According to the Statistics Canada in 2013, the rate of violence against women was 9 times the national rate. In 2014, 75% of reported intimate partner violence victims in the 3 territories were Indigenous, according to a study published in 2016. In 2014, the N.W.T. reported that 95% of those involved in the child welfare system are Indigenous children. Mr. Speaker, I understood that we all made family violence a priority. We'll make efforts to address the crises, particularly developing a plan and allocating resources and personnel and mobilizing to address the crises. Mr. Speaker, I saw some efforts and I was hopeful more concrete plans and actions will be undertaken. Programs such as the New Day program was changed and the domestic violence treatment option is somewhere in the department. Prominent program initiatives that gave people hope that yes, the government is doing something. Mr. Speaker, the government must at least throw a meaningful lifeline to the issue of family violence. We'll have questions to the Minister later in the House. Merci.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike, go down in the member Nehende.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Dennis Bubar was a true warrior, battling one disease after another up to his passing on June 23, 2018 at St. Boniface Hospital with his wife, Gloria, and his son at his side. Dennis was born and raised in Pine Falls, Manitoba, lived and worked in Winnipeg and Thompson, Manitoba, Toronto, Ontario, and most recently, Fort Simpson, N.W.T. In 2001, Dennis accepted a position with the Government of the Northwest Territories Department of Municipal and Community Affairs as a Capital Infrastructure and Work Planning Manager for the Decho region in Fort Simpson. Was their home for 17 years. Had the honor of knowing Dennis from the first day he started working for the department. His door was always open and he enjoyed when people stopped in and chatted with him. He loved and cherished Levi and his wife and wifey Gloria would be an understatement. Had the opportunity to talk to him about Gloria and Levi at least once a week. He truly loved them both. They were his reason for getting up in the morning, going to work, and more importantly, why he was excited to go home at lunch and after work. With Dennis's health failing and keeping a promise to Mama and Papa Law that he would take care of his family meant that he had to bring them home to Winnipeg. Their 5-day journey was of 28,000 kilometers was extremely difficult for their family. They were home for 1 week when Dennis was hospitalized with his 4th heart attack. As a diabetic for 40 years, Dennis had health issues affecting his eyes, heart, kidneys, limbs, and lungs. Even though Dennis was in constant pain, he was always very sociable and had a great sense of humor. I enjoyed the friendly banter with him, especially about his allowance. At least once every 2 weeks, he would show me a small amount of money and celebrate that he was being good, and his wife gave him some money. Dennis is survived by his wife Gloria, son Levi, Nicholas, Michael, and Derek, daughters Melissa, Nicole, and brother Harry, and sisters Linda and Sandra, and numerous grandchildren, great-grandchildren, nieces and nephews, and mama-in-law Catherine Hall. Dennis was preceded by his parents, Antoinette and William Bubar, and sister Bernadette, brother Larry, and brother-in-law, or papa-in-law Henry Hall. Family would like to thank the doctors, nurses, and staff at the Fort Simpson Health Centre, Stanton Regional Hospital in Yellowknife, N.W.T, the University of Alberta Hospital, and most recently, St. Boniface Hospital. The family would like to thank Alison DePelham, Val Gendron, as well all the people who helped him. In closing, it saddens me that he passed on. He was an amazing individual, serious sometimes, funny, and entertaining other times. However, I'm happy that he isn't feeling no pain and in a better place. I believe he will always be with his family and friends looking out for us. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi, our condolences to the family as well in the community. Member statements. Member statements. Returns to oral questions. Returns to oral questions. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Colleagues, I'd like to draw your attention to people in the gallery. We have with us a class of students here. One of them happens to be my buddy and my son, Ty Lafferty. Welcome to our assembly. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to recognize all the students from Aurora College, the social work and nursing program who have joined us today, and particularly my constituent from Cam Lake, Bovina Baudouin. Thank you for being here today. Thank you.
Masi. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Range Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to take a moment to recognize a lot of schools here. We have N.J. McPherson School, grade 4 and 5 students, and St. Pat's High School, grade 9. I'm not sure which one is your son, but welcome to the gallery. We also have students from the second year of the social work program and the 4th year of the Bachelor of Science in Nursing program. 22 students and faculty, so welcome. One of the faculty, student Fritzky, I recognize, and I apologize if I don't recognize the names of the other ones, but I also want to recognize some constituents within that. Lucinda Canapetrodo from Range Lake. I'm horrible with names, I'm sorry. Carrie Lynn Dunford and Kathy Pender are all nursing students and from the constituency of Range Lake, so welcome to the Ledge.
Masi. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Inuvik, Twin Lakes.
I'd like to welcome some visitors in the gallery from Inuvik. We have Mr. Joseph Karnagurski, who is the president of the DGO, Mr. Jimmy Kalenic, well-known drum dancer, snowmobile racing, and always nice to have another McLeod in the assembly. I'd like to recognize Jordan McLeod, and I'd also like to recognize all the students that are here, and I think one in particular is Jasmine Gordon. She's from Inuvik, so welcome to the assembly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Decho.
Masi, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to recognize Berna Maddow, who's the Degagut Dene translator. She will be here for the duration of the session to provide South Slavery translation. So, Masi.
Masi. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would like to recognize, of course, the students from Aurora College with regard to the social working and nursing program, but in particular, Susan Fitzke. She's also a resident of Yellowknife North, so welcome to the House. And I would also like to welcome the grade 9 students of St. Pat's, that is my junior high alma mater, and their teacher, Catherine Coolin. Welcome and thank you for being here.
Merci. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Grace Leaf.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I also want to take the opportunity to recognize a number of individuals in the gallery today from Aurora College, in particular some residents of the Great Slave Riding. First off, Jennifer Mackenzie, Hosai Ayubi, and Jessica Landreth. Welcome to the gallery. Thank you.
Merci. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Yellowknife South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to recognize two students from Yellowknife South, Julia Loomis and Shania Clark, and also Jordan McLeod. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Welcome, Clarky. AKA Clarky. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to recognize one of the nursing students in the gallery, a former co-worker who's just slaying popcorn together, Ms. Trista Nolt.
Merci. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Inuvik Boot Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to welcome Joseph Konagarski, Jimmy Kleinick, Jordan McLeod. I just want to say thank you for all the work that you do up in the Beaufort Delta region. Thank them for their leadership, their community involvement, all the volunteering that you do, and really appreciate it. And glad you guys can join us here today. Enjoy the proceedings. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I have a couple of Aurora College students I want to recognize in the gallery. They're Frame Lake residents, Kyle McPhee and Whitney Fraser. I also would like to recognize Mr. Andy Young. He's a resident of Yellowknife. He organized a successful fundraising hockey game that I got to play in on Saturday this past weekend, and the game was for Eugene Roach and his family. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd also like to recognize one of my constituents in the gallery and one of the youngest chairs in the Clavik Community Corp, Jordan McLeod. Also, Jimmy Kleinick and Joseph Karnagowski. I'd also like to thank you all for all the leadership you do in the communities. It's much appreciated. Merci.
Merci. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Yellowknife Center.
Mr. Speaker, I'm delighted to have the nursing and social work students here in the House today, and I would particularly like to recognize Jordan Erickson, Jody Prince, and Candace Ferdinand, who are joining us today. Thank you.
Merci. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Nehemde.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to also welcome all the social workers and nurses, students here today, and in particular one of my writing constituents, Nyla Gazon. Thank you very much. As well as I'd like to recognize my CA who makes me look good and does all the great work out there, and I'd like to thank her very much, Deborah Richards.
Merci. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for South 2.
Mr. Speaker, I also like to recognize all the social worker students and Candace Ferdinand, originally from Delany. Merci.
Merci. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Nanakput.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to recognize as well too Joseph Karnagarski, my high school buddy. Joseph is here making amendments to the Wildlife Act, and it's good to see his young leadership with the Gwich'in is also a negotiator for the Gwich'in. So I just want to give him a shout out to all the hard work he's doing, and also to Jimmy Kalenik, who recently, over the weekend, we were in Tuktoyaktuk for Persis Gruppen's 100th birthday. Jimmy is a very avid cultural performer, drum dancing in many aspects of the Inuvialuit culture. So shout out to Jimmy, as well to Jordan McLeod, who's my colleague from the Beaufort Delta says that he's one of the youngest chairs of the in the Inuvialuit Development Regional Corporation. So welcome to Jordan, and shout out to all the young guys who are working hard. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Recognition of visitors in gallery. If we're missing anyone in gallery, welcome to our chambers. It's always great to have an audience as part of our proceedings. Masi. Acknowledgments. Acknowledgments. Oral question. Member for Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today the Minister of Culture and Education and Employment did a minister statement on renewing the N.W.T education system. And on page 3, she spoke about revising the school funding framework to provide resources to ensure no less than 2 full-time teacher positions are allocated to each school. This is a very important step, and I'd like to thank the Minister and the Department for doing this. Mr. Speaker, can the Minister advise why this issue was not addressed before the start of the school year? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Why it wasn't addressed at the start of the school year is because the portfolio was just, we just had the shuffle in during this spring, April, I believe it was, so I had just taken on the portfolio of Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment. And it wasn't until the summer months, actually, that it was brought to my attention that we're actually not having more than 1 teacher in schools. And it was, I do have to recognize the MLA, Shane Thompson, for bringing that to my attention. It was a serious concern of his and a serious concern of mine. Safety is number 1. So it took a little bit of time because it was brought to my attention during the summer. It took a little bit of time to look at the process, to get the approvals that we needed to. But as soon as I heard about it, it was a priority. So I apologize if it wasn't timelier than it could have been, but I am glad that we solved the situation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question. Kasi member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for doing this. I appreciate her listening to the concerns and then working forward to helping the students and the teachers as well. So can the Minister advise us when will the changes be implemented to ensure the physical safety and mental health for the students and teachers? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So the decision just came through about around a month ago, actually, that I was allowed to do this decision. And so we phoned all of the education bodies. We notified them verbally. We're in the process now of doing written letters to them all, advising and then reinstating the funding so that they'll have the full year funding for the year. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question. Kasi member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the answer from the Minister, and I'm looking forward to seeing the positive impact it will have on the students and the teachers and the community. So will this, Mr. Speaker, will the Minister be able to tell us, will this change be a new policy moving forward, or is this just a one-time shot for this year? Thank you, Mr. Chair, or Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So we used internal funding for this year because I needed it done and I wanted it done now. But we have talked, and so we are putting together a proposal at this moment, and we'll be bringing it through the Financial Management Board for a decision for future funding. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question. Kasi member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for that answer and explaining the process. I hope the Financial Management Board will continue to support that, because I think this is a very important initiative being brought forth by the Minister. So can the Minister advise us, will this have an impact on the support staff, like the classroom assistants and language specialists? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, it will have an impact. It's going to mean better support for the students within the schools. So schools are still funded for a half-time position for a language instructor and also for a program support. So this is actually on top. This is actually more support for students. And it's about safety for our students. So it's a good thing, and I will do my best to make sure it's maintained. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Canada member Trinity Williday.
Mr. Speaker, I have questions for the Minister of Justice on my member statement on family violence. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the Minister a question on the 2007 needs survey, which was conducted by the N.W.T and the Coalition Against Family Violence, titled N.W.T Family Violence Attitudinal Survey. I'm wondering if the Department of Justice, in conjunction with other departments, are planning to conduct another family violence survey as done in 2007. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for his question. At this time, we're not aware of any plans for another attitudinal survey. The survey of 2007, some 11 years ago, was helpful in confirming the prevalence of this problem in the Northwest Territories. And we know that the problem has continued through the use of shelters, the rates of emergency protection orders, EPOs, crime statistics, and other measures. Now, I can advise that the GNWT is developing a comprehensive approach to addressing family violence. The goal of this work is to identify best practices, align existing GNWT work, and identify priority areas for investment over the coming decade. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Cassie member Trinity Williday.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, did the results of the 2000 family violence survey have an impact on policies of the Department of Justice? If so, what specific measures or policies to date are the direct result of this survey? Thank you.
Merci. Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can appreciate the question, and I know that the member appreciates that I wasn't here in 2007. However, I can point to certain improvements that have been made since that time. As members will know, the DVTO court is very active, and we have such programs as A New Day. So there have been improvements in the system which are being utilized. DVTO, I'm not sure when it started, but it has been in existence for some time. And the New Day program is newer, I believe, but also has been a success. We believe that these types of programs will reduce the amount of family violence. I mentioned that these programs are successful. Clearly, we need greater success to reduce the terrible level of family violence in the Northwest Territories. But we have taken steps. Thank you.
Merci. Oral question, Cassie member Trinity Williday.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, since the completion of that pre-mentioned 2007 family violence survey, has the perception of the Department of Justice changed regarding the way it handles cases relating to family violence? Thank you.
Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the department fully realized the seriousness of this item, and it is, of course, a shared priority amongst several departments. I mentioned that we are developing a comprehensive approach to addressing family violence, and maybe I can talk a little bit about the first steps that we are taking. The first phase will be focused on research and analysis and will result in a comprehensive strategy recommendation based on evidence and interjurisdictional analysis of best practices. Consultation with northern researchers is in progress, and the hope of having preliminary results, and we hope to have preliminary results in early 2019. In the second phase, we will be dealing directly with stakeholders and consulting with them on the results of the research so that we can receive meaningful guidance as to where we should proceed in the future. As I mentioned, we have certain programs in place. Clearly, those can be improved, and we're always looking for new ideas. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, N.W.T. member Trinity Willade.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Department of Justice has some role in the agreement between the RCMP and the Department of Justice. I'd like to ask the Minister if that department, or him specifically, meets regularly with RCMP and to talk about ways to address the combating of family violence. Thank you.
Minister of Justice.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for his question. I meet regularly with the RCMP, and we'll certainly bring up this specific issue. There are many issues that we do discuss, but clearly crime reduction is very important amongst them. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Yikadaya Canyon, the member Yellowknife Center.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my questions are for the Minister of Health and Social Services. The report I mentioned in my statement today reported to a ministerial committee on spousal assault in the Assembly of the Day in 1985. This committee brought together a wide range of service providers, officials from government departments, the status of women, and others whose work included family violence. What would it take for this minister to treat this crisis as a crisis and re-establish this coordinated approach to the issue? Merci.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was 14 when that report came out. We recognize that family violence is a crisis and is of incredible importance here in the Northwest Territories. In Cabinet, we have established different committees of Cabinet to focus in on some of the challenges that we face here in the Northwest Territories. We do have a social envelope committee of Cabinet that does look at this issue and look at how we can work better as departments to address those issues. I'm not convinced that right now we need to stand up a new committee. But I do hear the member, and I will certainly ask the departments to go back and look what was done in the past and whether or not there's value in re-establishing a committee like that, or whether or not we can do those things through our existing Social Envelope Committee of Cabinet. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Akira Cassie, member Yellowknife Center.
Mr. Speaker, the minister can find the report in the library, or I can lend him my copy and he can have a read of it. What I hear him saying is that he's going to create an echo chamber of government departments speaking to one another rather than consulting with people who are frontline service providers or who have a stake in this system as victims, as batterers, and so on. So why can't this work include a broader array of people than simply having people within government talk to one another? Merci.
Merci. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have a positive working relationship with the Y, with the Shelter Network, with the Status of Women, who are all working with us closely to create awareness and work to help reduce and hopefully eliminate family violence here in the Northwest Territories. We take their input. We have reviewed reports. Recently, a report came out in 2017 from shelter executive directors. So we aren't in an echo chamber. I appreciate the member's pessimism, but we believe this is important. We're working on this. We're working closely with our partners, and we'll continue to do so. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Untitled Chapter, member Yellowknife Center.
Mr. Speaker, this work is so important that in the last 3 years, the budget has increased by 5%, or $172,000. So on what basis is the minister treating this crisis as a crisis? Merci.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to make one quick correction. The research that I was referring to was actually conducted by the Aurora Research Institute, and it examined the responses to intimate partner violence in the Northwest Territories. With respect to funding, Mr. Speaker, the member knows how this assembly works. They know that we will have to go through a business planning process and that we have to make business case for increasing funds. And I'm proposing that we increase some funding to the shelters here in the Northwest Territories through the next budgeting cycle. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question, Nundere Akasi, member Yellowknife Centre.
Mr. Speaker, when the barges are a crisis, there's money to be found immediately, and the problem is on its way to resolution. Now that we're in the 4th year of this Assembly, the Minister is making a business case for more resources for family violence. I can't say it's too little, too late. Everything is appreciated. But the fact is that this area needs serious attention. It needs new initiatives, and I'm looking for a commitment for the Minister of action, not just talking. Is he able to make that commitment, Masi?
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Mr. Speaker, to address family violence is going to take a community. It's going to take multiple departments. The Department of Justice is doing a number of things, as is the Department of Health and Social Services. Education is doing things as far as educating youth. The Department of Health and Social Services alone is spending $2.9 million to fund shelters. We recognize through work that we've done with them that this isn't enough, so we will be proposing some increases in that area. On top of that, the Department of Health and Social Services alone spends another $477,000 to support different campaigns like What Will It Take? Different programs like the non-shelter regional protocols teams have been set up. That's $210,000. Programs for children who witness violence, $75,000. Territorial Family Violence Shelter Network, on top of what we give them, there's another $100,000. And the Family Violence Awareness Week, there's $10,000. I'd hardly say we're doing nothing. I agree we need to do more, and we're committed to doing that, and we will be discussing that through the next budget cycle. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question, the member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. My questions are for the Minister of Justice, who's responsible for victim services from this government. Can the Minister explain if there is a plan to expand the current community-based victim services offered through 10 coordinators to all of our communities, and if not, why not? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for his questions. There was a review in 2014 of victim service coordinators, and I can advise that this program started out in the late 1990s with funding initially for in 2 communities in the N.W.T, Yellowknife and Fort Smith. The Government of Northwest Territories now provides funding in 11 community, or rather 11 community-based victim services workers in 8 communities, including Yellowknife, Fort Smith, Inuvik, Fort Simpson, Betchico, Fort Good Hope, Toledo, and Hay River. And workers in those communities also provide victim services to surrounding communities through telephone outreach or in person if necessary. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I would like to thank the Minister for that information, but I don't think he really answered my question, which was whether we are going to complete this network of community-based victim services in all of the communities we have. But it's my understanding that victim service coordinators, they don't necessarily have access to funding to assist victims or to travel to victims to provide support for basic functions such as getting ready for court appearances. Expenditures seem to require approval of justice staff here in Yellowknife who don't seem to be available on a 24/7 basis. Can the Minister explain how victim services coordinators access the Victims of Crime Emergency Fund and whether support is available 24/7? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In addition to community-based funding, the N.W.T Victim Services Program administers the Victims of Crime Emergency Fund. This fund is intended to assist victims of serious violent crime. It can fund emergency expenses resulting from experiencing serious crime, as well as up to 6 sessions of emergency counseling with private counselors to help victims and secondary victims also deal with the consequences of victimization. Victim services are provided on a 24/7 basis, but it is not always possible to provide emergency funding at all hours of the day. However, the practice is to provide emergency funding as soon as possible. As I mentioned in my prior answer, we do provide funding for 11 community-based victim service workers in 8 communities. I don't know whether we could expand to all communities, but as I mentioned earlier, they do travel to communities outside of the 8. Thank you.
Merci. Oral question, Tadare, Cassie, Member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I'd like to thank the Minister for that information, and we'll talk more about completing the network. The exact duties and job descriptions of the victim service coordinators are not clear, as our government delivers these services through third parties in various communities. It's my understanding that some of these individuals perform many functions above and beyond the call of duty, including cleaning up crime scenes. Can the Minister explain exactly what type of supports are available for these coordinators and whether there's ever been a review of the effectiveness of these supports? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Justice.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, we do understand that the victim support workers do an incredible job, and it can be particularly difficult. Support for them, for the program, in order to recruit new workers was another recommendation referred to in the report, the 2014 report. They do get annual training opportunities and support to the, they do get annual training opportunities, so there is ongoing training that does take place. And in addition, every year the department holds a significant annual training event where the training provided is typically as a result of victim services providers' requests. Examples include child court accompaniment, critical incident stress debriefing, compassion fatigue, and self-care. So there is ongoing training. They do receive training, and also these meetings would assist them in that they can speak with their peers and learn from them. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Nundere, Cassie, Member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I'd like to thank the Minister for that. I was hoping to hear, though, about whether there's professional counseling available for the coordinators, but the community-based approach to victim services makes a lot of sense, and it's been in place, as the Minister said, since 1996, but clearly the network of supports and coordinators has never been completed. It's unclear how often and the review has ever been conducted on victim services. The Minister mentioned a 2014 report. Perhaps he could table that in the House. Can the Minister tell us, though, is he prepared to conduct a comprehensive review of victim services in the next year, 2019-20? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can advise that in addition to the programs and training that I mentioned earlier, that starting this year or this year, we are able also to start providing mental health supports above what the employers might provide. The member opposite mentioned the 2014 report. I haven't actually read the report. However, 5 years will have gone by early next year, and we are currently looking at conducting a follow-up next year. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, he could Kenny, the member saw too.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Further to my questions on inmate programming and services here, my first question, does the North Slave Correctional Centre have a main core program rehabilitation designed with sub-modules? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Justice.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, there are certain programs that I can speak of. The Corrections Service has implemented a substance abuse management SAM program, Living Without Violence, and Respectful Relationships programming designed to help inmates with shorter sentences, as well as those serving their sentence in the community. Now, if I might provide more detail with respect to some of those programs, the SAM program, Substance Abuse Program, or Substance Abuse Management Program, rather, was launched in 2016 and it has been delivered 36 times. The Violence Prevention and Living Without Violence Program was launched in 2017 and has been delivered 27 times. And the Respectful Relationships Program has been delivered 12 times. So these programs have been delivered in various facilities and hopefully will lead to rehabilitation of inmates so that they can rejoin society. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, la Cassie, member South 2.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thanks to the Minister for that information here. It's good to see that these are being offered, and I'm hoping that the inmates are taking advantage of these opportunities. My next question, Mr. Speaker, on the issue of trades or GED, can the Minister explain the success on how many inmates have enlisted in these two categories? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If I might mention some of the programs that we are offering to inmates at NSCC and FSCC: adult literacy, basic education, general education development, GED I think it's known as, high school and exam preparation, trades exam preparation, life skills. So far in fiscal 2018-19, enrollments in education programs are 38 inmates attending at the NSCC adult unit and 26 inmates attending at FSCC. I should mention also that the programs I mentioned earlier, such as SAM, are also offered in probation offices. Thank you.
Merci. Oral question, Cassie, member South 2.
Speaker, I recall here last year there was some collaboration efforts on designing a joint program between the New Day and the Centre. Can the Minister explain if that is underway? Thank you.
Minister of Justice.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do remember there was a discussion about that so that prisoners or inmates would be aware of the New Day program. I believe some progress has been made, and perhaps I could look into that further and give the member opposite a fuller answer. Thank you.
Oral question, the member Young Life North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, of course, this week is Family Violence Awareness Week, and normally these would be questions steered towards the Minister of Health and Social Services, but today I'm going to steer my questions towards the Minister of Finance. Mr. Speaker, we've heard earlier today in the House the discussion between my colleague from the Honourable Member of YK Centre and the Minister of Health and Social Services about financial resources. And so I would just like to ask the Minister, does the Minister have ways in which he can work with his colleagues at Finance and find some more or maybe some new additional resources that we can put towards this admitted identified crisis of family violence? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Finance.
We all know we're all well aware of the negative impacts of family violence across Northwest Territories. Through the Social Development Committee of Cabinet, they have been working and trying to come up with some initiatives, and when the departments have initiatives, they come forward to the department, or FMB, and they pitch those initiatives, and we in turn have a look at them, and if we have the financial resources, we look at trying to fund some of the initiatives that are brought forward to FMB. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Cassie, member Young Life North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for identifying a little bit more on the process. Aside from the departments recognizing that they have needs, is Cabinet identifying this as a crisis? And, is the Minister of Finance, the lead minister responsible for funding, will he lead the way in encouraging his Cabinet to support additional funds to help us overcome this identified crisis? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, of course, Cabinet is aware of the impacts of family violence across the Northwest Territories. Both sides of the House are aware of the negative impacts of family violence across the Northwest Territories. There's opportunities for us to put some resources to some of the programs to help combat that, then we'd be unwise not to. We heard one of the members talk before about the percentage that family violence has come down in some particular communities, and I would like to think that is a result of people in the community starting to take action, but in some cases there may be the financial resources available to them to help them try and combat this. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Tada Cassie, member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for reminding us of the great work that the government is doing and all of the respective departments. And I appreciate that we are doing a lot of great things, and it is a large challenge in front of us. Not long ago, Mr. Speaker, we are all familiar in 2014 with the Truth and Reconciliation Report and the calls to action. And so maybe I'd like to ask the Minister of Finance that, given that this is a government-wide, call it initiative or recognition with regard to the calls to action, what kind of financial resources is the Minister putting towards these calls to action? Because they are so interlinked with a lot of the matters that we're dealing with regard to family violence. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my understanding is that there's been some proposals that have been brought forward. We'll have a look at those proposals and see if there's opportunities for us to put any financial resources towards them. This is an issue, as the member said, that you don't have to look any further than Northwest Territories to see the legacy of residential schools. So we'll do what we can to try and put some resources towards some of the plans. We have to make sure we have a plan first. We can't just throw money at something. We need to make sure that we have a plan and those resources are being put to good use and they're actually doing what they're intended to do, is to help people deal with some of the legacy of family violence and residential schools. So I mean, we go through a business planning process. Departments come forward with some of the initiatives they like to see move forward. We go through a business planning process. We hear back from committee on some of their priorities and what they'd like to see some of the resources go to. So we'll continue to work on that, but my understanding is there is a proposal, I believe, that's being brought forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, the member Decho.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yesterday I was reminded of, a circumstance of a person that you might find yourself in, and that's facing a crisis. And I was reminded that yesterday, in terms of the discussion on child and family services, you face a crisis, say like you're in a boat that's sinking, and the captain tells you, well, stay calm, and relax, and despite not having a life jacket, you're going to be okay. And yesterday, that's what I was told, and unfortunately, that's the reality and challenges that we're faced with. So my question is to the Minister of Health and Social Services. The mandate priority of the 18th Assembly was to address the whole issue of family violence as a crisis. And we've made efforts in working to address that family violence. And we look to our cabinet colleagues, the minister, for their leadership role. And I know there's been efforts like the New Day program, and there's efforts to maintain shelters in each region and communities. Can the minister update this House the steps that his department has taken to address the mandate priority that we set aside to address family violence? Masi.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, a zero-based budget exercise conducted during the 17-18 fiscal year was done to help inform a funding model for shelters here in the Northwest Territories. That work has had significant progress. From there, we will be proposing some increases in the funds available to the shelters throughout the Northwest Territories for the next budget cycle. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Council Member Decho.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the Minister for his reply. The other question that I have is we need to get beyond, the attitudes in terms of the whole crisis of family violence in communities. We need to try to at least have some discussions and some of the cultural barriers that we have to go through. And one of the challenges, in my view, is we need to ensure that the initiatives that we undertake has a wide rollout, that it's not just perhaps the idea that Yellowknife is basically making statements on family violence. The regions and communities have to be involved. How is the minister and his department undertaking to ensure that communities and regions are involved and families are involved with the discussion of trying to bring down the rates of family violence? Masi.
Masi. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, once again, the Department of Health and Social Services isn't alone in working to address family violence. We are one of the partner departments in coming up with solutions and programs that will help us reduce the incidence of family violence. However, having said that, the Department of Health and Social Services is doing a number of things. One of the things that we do is we fund the What Will It Not campaign. And in that vein, we are working on some new videos to help address family violence and create awareness. One of them is going to be on consent, and that work is currently being done. There's a video for adults being done as well as a video for youth. And there's also another video on elder abuse, and the filming is currently being done in early December, and that work is being done in Fort Good Hope. There is an advisory group of elders supporting this video. So we are reaching out to people outside of Yellowknife to create more product and more campaigns to help us address this. Mr. Speaker, we're also working on a shelter awareness campaign. This is an N.W.T-wide campaign to raise awareness about shelter services and how people can access them. The department does have a contribution agreement with the Hay River Family Support Centre in partnership with the Y here in Yellowknife. So once again, we're not just relying on input from those in Yellowknife, but input from those across the Northwest Territories who are on the front lines of addressing family violence. We're doing the work, Mr. Speaker. We're doing the work. And obviously more needs to be done. We hear you, and we are planning to make some improvements starting the next fiscal year when we make the proposal to increase funding for shelters. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Council Member Decho.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, throughout my thoughts on making a statement and the questions that I had, I wanted to come to a common understanding, and wanted to hear some good news and get a status in terms of whether indeed we're addressing our mandate, and and look and to see if there's ways that from this side of the House we could help the leadership in terms of the minister leading the charge against addressing family violence in the North. I think we have to get beyond the whole stage of denial and admit that we have a problem, and that's a big challenge that I see. Has the minister in his eyes ensured that this is a crisis levels that warrants a crisis response, and is the minister confident that we've done all that we can to address family violence? Masi.
Masi. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Mr. Speaker, there are societal issues around this, and that we need to do more, and we need to continue to work together to destroy the stigma that exists around family violence. We need people talking about it. We have heard positive statements about the work we're doing with What Will It Take, but we acknowledge that we need to continue to evolve and develop more programs and more awareness around family violence, which is why we're moving forward with these new videos that talk about consent, and one's being done for adults and one's being done for youth. But we're also talking about, elder abuse as it falls under family violence. And we are working with partners. We are trying to bring more. This is what we're proposing for this particular budget cycle, but there will be more. We have to continue to evolve. We have to continue to get the message out there, and we have to continue to work together. Mr. Speaker, we have a number of videos out already, and I would strongly encourage the member and all members to redistribute these videos through your social media campaigns, through your social media means. We need to work together to get the message out there, to continue to destroy the stigma, break it down, and have people talk about it. The more people are fighting against it, the better the results will be. It's going to take all of us, Mr. Speaker. What will it take?
Oral question. No dere kasi member Decho.
Must you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my final question is, well, more likely to be two questions. The first question, the question would be, does the minister feel we have addressed and did all we can to address our priority in making the 18th Assembly by addressing family violence, or does he also feel that this whole challenge would probably flow into the 19th Assembly? Masi.
Members asking for opinion of the minister's feeling. I'll allow a minister to respond if he wishes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, domestic violence and family violence in the Northwest Territories is a long-standing problem. And we as an Assembly, we as a group of 19 members have made it a mandate item. To that end, we have done work to develop a formula, and we've also improved and increased the amount of information we have out there to help break down the stigma. Mr. Speaker, in the life of this Assembly, we are intending and we will increase the funding that we provide to shelters. Is it alone enough to solve the problem of family violence here in the Northwest Territories? Absolutely not, but it is an important part of the puzzle, as is creating additional awareness. One of the members earlier today talked about forming another committee. Mr. Speaker, we have relationships with important organizations that are doing important things to curb family violence here in the Northwest Territories. The Department of Justice is doing a number of things as well. Do I think we've solved the problem of domestic violence in this Assembly? Absolutely not. Do I think we've taken important steps to help address it? Absolutely. Can more be done, and will more be done? Absolutely. This is going to continue into the next Assembly because we're not going to find that magical light switch that turns off domestic violence. It's going to take all of us championing together, working together, getting the message out there, and opposing all those that are committing domestic violence and telling them that it's wrong and that they need to take account for their actions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question, the member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have a few questions for the Minister of Infrastructure in regards to the Willow River Bridge near Clavik. Mr. Speaker, a lot of work has been done over the last number of years. I'd actually like to thank the department for the contributions they've given us over the years. Mr. Speaker, it's not as simple as just buying a bridge and putting it in place, even though it sounds that easy. Mr. Speaker, there's a lot of planning and engineering that has been completed to date. Permits are in place, and we are now at the final stages to installing the bridge. Now all we need is the proper funding to ensure that this work is actually done and the bridge is installed. So will the minister continue to work with the community of Aklavik and their working group to secure funds to put the Willow River Bridge in place? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My understanding, there's still some outstanding issues with the Willow River Bridge. There's still some engineering work that needs to be completed, environmental approvals and permits that need to be put into place. But what I can tell the House was When the Premier and I were in Inuvik here a couple of weeks ago, we took the time to meet with the Mayor and the Regional Director that we have for the Northern Region to sit down and have a conversation about the challenges about getting this bridge completed. And we've committed the Regional Director to sit down with all the proponents in Acknowledgments to have these discussions to see how we can move this project forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Akita Council Member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, like I mentioned in my opening comments, the engineering and planning has been completed and the permits are in place. So will the Minister commit to completing the Willow River Bridge by the end of the winter? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll gladly sit down with the member and make sure that these engineering work and the environmental approvals and permits are in place. But it's not infrastructure's place to fund this completion of this bridge. We're going to have to figure out where we're going to get this money. I know from our bilaterals that we signed, there's a possibility that we can actually use something out of the bilateral around community funding with the Minister of MACA. We might have to have a look at that, what's going forward. And we will continue to help support this initiative moving forward. But we're going to have to, if this work is completed that the member is stating is completed here, and it must have been just done here lately, we're certainly going to have to sit down and figure out a way to how we're going to be able to fund this thing. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Council Member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Minister is a professional at finding funds for projects like this. Mr. Speaker, as the Minister knows, we have a short window to do this construction up near Clavik, as we don't have an all-season road there at this moment, but our work needs to be done within the winter months. So we have a short window of about three to 4 months. Mr. Speaker, it's very important that we have this money to complete this bridge. We're at the final stages, like I mentioned, so now more than ever, we need this funding to complete this work, and I'm glad the Minister is willing to sit down with the community, and I'm sure once we do our tour there, we'll be able to sit down there. But would the Minister be willing to meet within the next couple of days? I know he's traveling tomorrow, but we have this evening to meet with our community leader that's actually in the community in the city at the moment. So will he commit to a meeting this evening? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Speaker, I think the member offered to buy me supper, so I'm coming. But I can make time to meet with the MLA and the community leader after session today. We have a meeting after session, but this evening. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Kennedy, the member, Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier, like many other members, I spoke about the crisis of family violence and the need for the N.W.T to mobilize, like it's actually addressing the crisis. I heard that the government is undertaking cross-jurisdictional analyses of best practices, but I'm afraid that's not the silver bullet that's going to address this problem. So in the meantime, we need to support the organizations that are on the front line supporting the victims of family violence. One of those organizations is the Family Support Center in Hay River. They provide a safe space for people fleeing family violence. They've had to demolish their old site, and they're right now working out of a temporary site. However, there's this federal National Housing Strategy money, the co-investment fund, that seems tailor-made for organizations like this. And one of the necessary partners in that is the N.W.T, and that's flowing through the Housing Corporation. And so I brought this to the Minister's attention, and they've reached out to the Family Support Center, and the Housing Corporation has been working with the Family Support Center, and I'd like an update from the Minister on what work has been done to date. Thank the Minister of the Housing Corporation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of N.W.T Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I agree with the member that some of our partners, our stakeholders, non-government organizations that are on the front line doing the work for people, as we heard today, there was a lot of statements on victim services, and appreciate the work that the Hay River Family Support Center has been doing. And I do know that the member has brought this up before, especially when the federal government made the announcement on the co-investment fund. He was on top of that and wanted to see what we can do in terms of partnering with the Hay River Family Support Center. I am committed, and I have gotten my staff to go and have a meeting with the Hay River Family Support Center, as well as having chats with the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation to ensure that all the application guidelines and requirements are met, and that we are going to be having a meeting in the coming weeks to make sure that the application's done properly, and that those types of funds that the Family Sports Center is looking for has been done properly, so that they can have an opportunity to secure those funds. I know it has been taking a little bit of a long time, but as I mentioned, I am committed to working with the member, working with the Hay River Family Support Center, and making sure my staff is in contact with them to get their building up and running again, so that they can provide the services for their community members. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Just as a note, we're continuing.
Oral question, Akita Cassie, member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate that answer. I know the minister stated it is taking a long time, and there's federal money. There's a lot of information they need, and I appreciate the department is helping the Family Support Center get that information. But I think everyone would like to see this move a little quicker. So can the minister offer us? The first day back to sitting, I said I'm here to light a fire under cabinet. So that's what I'm trying to do. Can we get things moving a little quicker? And what kind of timeline can we expect before we actually see money start rolling out and we can see shovels in the ground? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of N.W.T. Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I answered some questions last week in terms of how we had gotten shortchanged on the Northern Housing Fund. We're continuing to work with the federal government to ensure that we secure funding from them so that we can have strong partnerships. And I've always said that one of the strong points of the Housing Corporation is developing those partnerships. I've made two statements in the House about working with the Clecho government, as well as working with the Indian Valley Regional Corporation. This is another partnership that I want to get on, and we're just waiting to get some of these details, sign our bilaterals with the federal government, so we get that money flowing, so it goes to the communities, so it goes to initiatives such as the Family Support Center, homelessness initiatives, housing initiatives, and we're continuing to put that pressure on the federal government. I'm committed to making sure that we get that funding so that our residents have a roof over their heads, our NGOs have a roof over their heads, so they can provide these good programs. So I just want to let the member know that I don't have a timeline in place. We are still working with the federal government to ensure that we get that funding flowing to our government and then to the communities, as well as the Indigenous organizations, and working with our NGOs. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Tadade Cassie, member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate that answer. And the minister mentioned a lot of things there, homelessness, poverty, and often what accompanies family violence is situations like homelessness and poverty. And so it's not just the Family Support Center in Hay River that provides support. There's also places like the Soup Kitchen, and they're also in need of a new building. And this family or this co-investment fund could be used for them as well. And I've spoken with them a bit about it, but would the minister be willing to get his department to reach out to the Soup Kitchen in Hay River to see if he can also work with them to get an application for a new building with this co-investment fund? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Minister of N.W.T. Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The N.W.T. Housing Corporation has a lot of programs that we initiate to assist places like the Soup Kitchen. One of the ones that comes to mind is the Small Community Homelessness Fund, in terms of providing O&M for such organizations like that. I know we have other departments that provide O&M costs for whether it's the Soup Kitchen or the Family Support Center. However, if we're looking at infrastructure investments, it is on an application base. We are working with CMHC as well as our other stakeholders to look at investing in certain infrastructure projects like that. I would encourage the staff, the board, the member to maybe sit down with myself and we can see what we can do moving forward. But we are committed to working with our stakeholders, our NGOs, Indigenous governments to address some of these issues. And like I mentioned, we're going to continue to put pressure on the federal government so that we get dollars that can actually go out into the communities to provide homes and provide infrastructure and projects for our residents of the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Nundere Council Member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So if I arrange something between the soup kitchen and the Housing Corporation, can the Housing Corporation sit down with the board and figure out how to move forward with this? Because this co-investment fund, it's a big application. The feds want a lot of information, and you know, the Housing Corporation has been good at helping navigate that. So if I set something up, will he commit that his department can sit down and just see how the soup kitchen can access this money to get a new building? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of N.W.T. Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. From my understanding, the soup kitchen that the members referencing does do a lot of programs for a lot of people in the community, and I know that they probably do need more space to allow people to go in and have a meal. It would be a proposal and application based, as I mentioned earlier, with the Hay River Family Support Center. We are working with that organization as well as CMHC to make sure that all the application guidelines are understood and that the requirements are met so that they can meet the requirements to get funding. So we'd have to see a proposal, we'd have to sit down, and I think that's the next step we take from this. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, he could add the member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, last week and yesterday I was asking questions of Minister Valance. He's informed me through an email that his department and regional staff, and they're doing a great job. I have to give the regional staff kudos for the job that they're doing. They've met with Acknowledgments, and tomorrow they'll be, tomorrow they'll be meeting with the FN. So will the minister, after his staff has met with these two IGOs, will he be willing to provide that presentation to us so that we can now share it on to other people? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Lands.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I mentioned yesterday, we did send a series of letters out to IGOs, and we are commencing engagement with them. We want to build a good relationship with them, and to that end, I don't think there would be much benefit in making the document or our plans public at this stage. I know that some information has been provided to committee as to our plans with respect to this complex matter. We're just at stage one, which involves consulting with and hearing from Aboriginal groups, and we don't want to do anything that might adversely affect that important relationship. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Akita Council Member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the minister for the non-answer again. It's really discouraging, very discouraging to see this government is downloading on the IGOs. They're saying, here you go, here you go. They're not taking responsibility. We're trying to get information out there. So the minister said it was stage one, or step one. So minister, please explain how many stages is through this, since we can't get this information out there. So how many stages is there? And the minister talks about a letter. It's dated or stamped confidential. So we can't even share this information. So can the minister tell us how many stages are there? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Lands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are several stages, and we're only at stage one. Now, the member opposite has talked about the information that and the plans that we do have. We do not want to intervene between Aboriginal groups and their members. We are consulting with them. They doubtless will pass on information to their members. I don't think it would be appropriate or sensible to us for us to intervene between leadership and members. Thank you.
Oral question, Tada Council Member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hear the minister saying you don't want to get in between the IGOs and their members. Well, some of those members actually are constituents of mine. They're asking me these questions. The trapper that's out there has a cabin there. He sometimes doesn't go to these meetings, but the minister wants the DFN or the Acknowledgments First Nations to go out there and get that information. So when the minister talks about several stages, is it 100 stages? Is it 4 stages? Is it 10 stages? Can the minister tell us how many stages are there and what the final result will be? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Lands.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. I mentioned that we do not want to intervene between Aboriginal groups, Aboriginal governments, and their members. It's important that the leadership hears from us as to what our plans are, consults with us, and then deals directly with their members. I think that we do not want to intervene between those two groups of leadership and members. The member asked about how many stages. There are several stages. We're just at the first stage, and our ultimate goal is to resolve this very complex issue, but we're only at stage 1. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Nundida Council Member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Stage 1, is that the only number he knows? Because really, I've asked the question, how many stages are there? Stage 1, yes, we know that. But we're trying to find out how many stages are there. Because is it 100? And at the end of the day, who makes the final decision on who has, what is it called? Rights-based cabins. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Lands.
230, less than 10.
There are far less, Mr. Speaker, than 100 steps. I'm pleased to advise the House. À peu près de 5.
Oral question, written questions. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have the following questions concerning the performance of the N.W.T Liquor and Cannabis Commission addressed to the Honourable Minister of Finance. What are the total sales of cannabis products by the N.W.T Liquor and Cannabis Commission and its vendors by quantity, price, volume, and number of customers? What are the total sales of each individual cannabis product by the N.W.T Liquor and Cannabis Commission and its vendors by quantity, price, volume, and number of customers? What is the quantity and type of cannabis products distributed to each cannabis vendor by the N.W.T Liquor and Cannabis Commission in the Northwest Territories? And what are the total sales of cannabis products purchased through the N.W.T Liquor and Cannabis Commission online store by quantity, price, volume, and number of customers? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Written questions. Written questions. Returns to written questions. Returns to written questions. Replies to Commissioner's opening address. Replies to Commissioner's opening address. Petitions. Petitions. Reports to Standing Special Committee. Reports to Standing Special Committee. Reports on Committee on Review of Bills. Reports on Committee on Review of Bills. Tabling of documents. Minister of Environment and Natural Resources.
I wish to table the following document entitled Follow-up Letter for Oral Question 385, 18-18, bracket 3, Community Landfills and Waste Disposal. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Tabling of documents. Tabling of documents. Notices of motion. Notices of motion. Notices of motion for first reading of bills. Minister responsible for worker safety compensation
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I give notice that on Friday, October 26, 2018, I will move that Bill 25, an act to amend the Workers' Compensation Act, be read for the first time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Notices of motion for first reading of bills. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I give notice on Friday, October 26, 2018. I will move that Bill 26, Statistics Act, be read for the first time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Notices of motion for first reading of bills. Notices of motion, first reading of bills. Motions. Motions, first reading of bills. First reading of bills, second reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Consideration Committee of the Whole of Bills and Other Matters. Minister Statement 19-18.3, Minister Statement 103-18.3, Table Document 215-18.3, Table Document 255-18.3, and Table Document 256-18.3 with Member Hale-River North in the chair.
I now call Committee of the Whole to order. What is the wish of committee? Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, committee would like to take into consideration table document 255-18 brackets 3 supplementary estimates brackets infrastructure number 3 2018-2019 and table document 256-18 brackets 3 supplementary estimates brackets operations number 3 2018-2019. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. Does committee agree? Thank you. Committee, we will consider the documents after a brief recess. It's bomb. I'll call Committee of the Whole back to order. Committee, we have agreed to consider supplementary estimates infrastructure expenditures number 3, 2018-2019. I will turn to the Minister of Finance for any opening remarks you may have. Minister McLeod.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I'm here to present supplementary estimates infrastructure expenditures number 3, 2018-2019. This document provides for an increase of $4.6 million to the capital budget. The items in these supplementary estimates include $4.8 million to commence work for 3 projects related to the Mackenzie Valley All-Season Road Project. These expenditures will be partially offset by funding from the National Trade Corridors Fund, $400,000 for the planning study for the midlife upgrade and retrofit of the Prince of Wales Northern Heritage Centre. These expenditures will be partially offset by funding from the federal government. A decrease of $642,000 to reflect changes in the timing of the expenditures of the fish processing plant project. This decrease is offset by an equivalent increase in expenditures in 2019-2020. That concludes my opening remarks, Mr. Chair. I would be pleased to answer any questions members may have. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Do you wish to bring witnesses into the House?
I would, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Sergeant at Arms, please escort the witnesses into the chamber. Minister, you may take your place at the witness stand. Minister McLeod, would you please introduce your witnesses for the record?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, to my right I have Mr. David Sturt, who is the Deputy Minister, Department of Finance. To my left I have Mr. Sandy Kugluktar, who is the Deputy Secretary to the FMB. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Welcome back to the witnesses. Committee, I will open the floor to general comments on supplementary estimates. General comments on the supplementary estimates. We're discussing supplementary estimates infrastructure expenditures. First, I have Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is an increase of $4.6 million to the capital budget. Can the minister provide the impact to the supplementary reserve for infrastructure expenditures? Thank you.
Thank you. Minister?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, of the $4.6 million, we got 3.7 approximately coming from the being offset by funding from the federal government, and the net impact on the supplementary reserve would be approximately $1.5 million. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, what after the 1.5 million is expended, what is the total remaining balance in the supplementary reserve? Thank you.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. At this point, would be a negative $1.3 million.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So what is the process for resolving that deficit? Can the minister just explain where that money will come from? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Stewart.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So as well as a supplementary reserve for infrastructure, we also have one for operations funding. And then there is an estimate that goes into the main estimates on how much will be lapsed by departments over the year. So as part of the public accounts process, all of that is reconciled, and we'll know whether we end up with a different cash position than what was forecast at the time of the main estimates. But it's really after the end of the fiscal year and we get a final accounting of all three of those pots that we'll be able to know what the impact would be overall on the cash position. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Is the minister confident that we have sufficient flexibility through lapsed funding, through supplementary reserves, that this balance will be reconciled without requiring an additional appropriation? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. Minister.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, we're about halfway through the year, but we are pretty confident that we'll be able to reconcile.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. Testart.
Thank you. Nothing further, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Next, I have Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. My colleague from Cam Lake asked the questions I was going to. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Next, for general comments on the infrastructure expenditure supplementary estimate, I have Mr. McNeely.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To the appropriation, I just share my recent trips and recent trip here over the last couple of days here to finish off the engagement session for two of the communities that were postponed here back in mid-August. So when I review the presentations here made by the infrastructure project team to the public and the leaders, advising them that this would be the schedule, knowing the fact that some of the workload is only accessible for this winter or any other winter for that matter. So I view this bill or this approval process as a timely one to support the work program that is being proposed to get off the road and running here this coming January. Hopefully by that time they would have their permits to support the geotechnical needed to support these two particular sites in the Sahtu. One being the Bear River Bridge and the other being the Oscar Creek Bridge relocation. So I just share that information there. How this would support the execution of the workload. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McNeely. Would the minister care to respond?
I don't remember.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I appreciate the members' comments, and it's one of the reasons that we debate the budget, the capital budget in the fall time, is so once it's approved, if it's approved, then that gives time for planning. And if those are successful in getting contracts through this process, then they can take advantage of the winter roads and have their planning to have a lot of their material into their respective communities in a timely fashion. We've run into some issues in the past where in the old capital budget planning process, we'd approve a budget and then contractors would go get material. I think we had one instance in one community where they didn't get their material till November the 1st, and that caused some delays. So no, the timing is critical to those that are hoping to secure some of the work through the funds that are appropriated through the capital budget planning process. But again, I appreciate the members' comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Anything further from Mr. McNeely?
None. Thank you, Mr.
Nothing further from Mr. McNeely. Next, Mr. Bolio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'm looking at the estimates for infrastructure, Department of Infrastructure, $4.8 million on split between the Bear River Bridge, Cadet Mountain, and then the environmental assessment for the MVH. I'm wondering if there is an appropriation in all of these three areas, since this is a supplementary for this current year. What is the budget for this current year for not so much the environmental planning, but for the Cadet Mountain and Bear River Bridge. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Bolo. These are general comments, but it's a small sub, so I'll go to the minister and perhaps we can get the questions out of the way.
Yeah, this is the money. This is, yeah, there's actually no money appropriated for the actual project itself until we get this work done. Let me have a look at that. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, the figure that you see there is actually the figure that was that's the only money that's appropriated for these particular projects. Once the planning and that's done, they'll be coming forward in 2019-20 for large appropriation to start the actual building. Thank you, Mr.
These are 1920 capital estimates.
Yeah, 1920. Yeah.
Thank you. Nothing further from Mr. Bolio. Next, Mr. Van Thyn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I'm prepared to go into questions if we've reached that point and if there's no further general comments. Thank you.
Does committee agree we proceed to the detail? Thank you, committee. Please turn to page 6. Comments or questions? If not, I will call this item. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. This is with regard to a planning study for the midlife upgrade and retrofit to the Prince of Wales Northern Heritage Centre, the museum that's here in Yellowknife. Can the minister or staff explain whether any of this has to do with fire code or building code work that might be required at the museum? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, my understanding the planning study will produce a Class C cost estimate and preliminary schematic design. The study will look at a wide range of capital needs for the Prince of Wales Northern Heritage Centre, including the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, collection storage, space quantity and quality, asbestos remediation, if any is found, geotechnical assessment of the Prince of Wales Northern Heritage Reserve land, security and safety concerns, public access and employee workspace requirements, and aesthetic factors like retail space, accessibility, marketing, and exhibit design. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the list of items that the planning study is going to review. I know that half of the funding is going to come from the federal government, and I support this work. I just want to make sure that it gets done in a timely fashion. What are the prospects that we could obtain federal funding under the Canada Cultural Spaces Fund for the actual midlife update itself, the renovations that are going to be required? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Minister.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, the federal government, they did announce some funding over 2 years for the Canadian Culture CCSF as part of this 2016 budget. The further amount of money was allocated over 10 years in the 2017 budget. Once we get the planning study and that done and the Class C estimate, we'll be in a better position to know exactly what we're looking for from the federal government. There's opportunities for us to put applications in to try leverage more federal funding to help with this project, and we'll certainly pursue that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Appreciate that from the minister. Do we know when this study is going to be finished, and is it something that can be shared with regular MLAs? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. The anticipation is that we'll attempt to have the study done during this fiscal year, and we'd be pleased to give committee regular updates as we move along in this process. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Appreciate that. Look forward to getting a copy of the final study. Can the minister tell us, is there anything for the museum midlife update or upgrade and renovations in the 20-year capital plan? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
I don't think there's anything big.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I believe there's a small amount that's allocated in the capital estimates. I'm not quite sure what the number is, but as we get into the debate on the capital estimates, I'm sure we'll have a better idea of the money that may have been allocated to any work that needs to be done. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, this is a comment more than anything else. Look, I support this work. I want it done, and I want it done quickly. We want to avoid at all costs what happened to the National Museum in Brazil. And I'm not saying we're going there, but there's a lot of heritage value and culture tied up in the facility here in Yellowknife. It does support regional facilities as well, so we want to make sure that our museum is up to code and fully protected and provides the kinds of services and programs that our citizens deserve. So I support this, and I urge the minister, along with his colleague, the Minister of Education, Culture and Employment, to get on and get this work done. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. I'll take it as a comment. Next, I have Mr. Van Thyn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to my colleague from Frame Lake for his line of questioning. Mine is along the lines of that project as well. Department of Education, Culture and Employment, the Prince of Wales Heritage Centre. And so I just want to dig deeper a little bit into the, I'm going to assume that while we're calling it a planning study, it seems to me like this is a little bit more of what the government typically undertakes as being a technical evaluation of an asset. And although we're appropriating $400,000 additional, the total appropriation is for just over $1 million. And it seems concerning to me that Class C for $1 million on a midlife technical evaluation is a considerable amount of money. Even $400,000, quite frankly, is a considerable amount of money. What are we missing that we're not going to get in this evaluation? Like, how can we not, with this kind of money, bring the evaluation to a tighter, call it, estimate, and maybe hopefully get like a Class B level estimate that we can consider? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Chair, and that may well be. I mean, if we do a Class C estimate, and if there's opportunities there to upgrade that estimate to get a more accurate indication of the type of funds we need, if it falls within the money that we have appropriated, then we should, I think we should go in that direction. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Van Thyn?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you to the Minister for the reply. One of the things that I would advocate for strongly is that, and we're going to see potentially some discussion about this in future budget deliberations, but you know, I would like to see the Prince of Wales Northern Heritage Centre be considered as a building that we might connect with others, including the Legislative Assembly, say City Hall, D&D and the RCMP, with regard to developing a district energy system. And you know, could that be something that this technical evaluation or planning study undertakes, or in fact, would we be expecting to undertake that kind of a review when we're talking about the mechanical and heating system, and can we consider that connection with a potential district heating system? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Van Dyne. Minister?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not sure the exact detail. I'd have to have a conversation, or we'd have to have a conversation with infrastructure to see what their scope might include. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Van Dyne?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate that. What I would encourage maybe then is to have the minister reach out to the appropriate cabinet colleagues and maybe also the capital site area committee, planning committee, because I believe that this is an undertaking that they're giving consideration to, is to take a number of these buildings in the area and try to connect them under a district energy system. And you know, as it relates to our energy strategy and our climate change strategic framework, I think this would check off a lot of boxes for us. And so while we're using these kinds of resources to do this kind of a technical evaluation, it would only seem that through economy of scale and for other reasons that would be the right time to see if we could connect the Prince of Wales Northern Heritage Centre to a district energy system, one in which the capital site area plan is already kind of working toward. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Van Dyne. Minister?
I'm not sure there's a question here. It was more of a comment, but as I said before, we'll have conversation with the appropriate parties to see if there's opportunities to and see what their exact scope of work is, and if there's opportunities to expand on that. We'll have those conversations. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Seeing no further comments, I will call this item. Education, culture and employment, capital investment, expenditures, culture, heritage, and language not previously authorized, $400,000. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. Education, culture and employment, capital investment, expenditures, total department not previously authorized, $400,000. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. Please turn to page 7, industry, tourism, and investment. Comments or questions? Seeing none, I will call this item industry, tourism, and investment, capital investment expenditures, economic diversification, and business support not previously authorized, negative $642,000. Does committee agree? Industry, tourism, and investment, capital investment expenditures, total department not previously authorized, negative $642,000. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. Please turn to the last page. Infrastructure. Comments, questions? Seeing none, I will call Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So our government, I guess, is partnering and getting some money from the federal government to proceed with parts of the Mackenzie Valley Highway. Can the minister explain what the status is of the Mackenzie Valley Highway Environmental Assessment that's before the Mackenzie Valley Environmental Impact Review Board? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly.
Yeah, Chair. Mr. Chair, I didn't quite hear what the member had to say. I apologize. Part of the next capital budget, maybe we'll put some new allocation in for new earpieces, but I believe Mr. Kugluktar heard that, so I will ask Mr. Kugluktar to respond. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. Kugluktar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's my understanding that the department is still in the very early days of planning the work required on the environmental process for the Mackenzie Valley Highway. I think once this appropriation gets approved, the work will start ramping up relatively shortly. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, the environmental assessment's been going on since 2013. So, and the last letter from our government on the public registry is dated May the 18th, 2016. That's 2.5 years ago. Look, I want this work to go ahead as probably as much as anybody else in this House, but unless we sort out how this work fits in with what the review board is doing, and the legislation prevents work from going ahead that is an environmental assessment. So what is the department doing to get this sorted out with the review board so that the work can go ahead? If the last correspondence from our government on the review board website is May the 18th, 2016. What are they doing to sort this out? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. The Minister MacLeod has indicated that he would like Minister Schuman to answer. Minister Schuman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I stated in the House there when we were talking about this earlier in the week, the Department of Infrastructure's staff has been meeting with the regulatory boards, including the Mackenzie Valley Highway and, including the Mackenzie Valley Environmental Impact Review Board to discuss next steps. So those discussions are ongoing. We're trying to figure out a way to proceed with terms of ongoing with the environmental assessment, considering that we don't get funding for the whole road. And I've stated in the House the bridge is a totally separate permitted issue, so that's outside of the scope of the Mackenzie Valley Highway. But those discussions are ongoing, and then we want to be able to take those discussions and go to the Indigenous governments to figure out next steps going forward with any other organizations as well. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So, given that the Minister of Finance, Minister of Infrastructure are looking for an appropriation for 2018-19, when is the specific work for, say, the Mount Cadet access road supposed to start? Is the intention to start it in 2018-19? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister MacLeod would like this to go to Minister Schuman again. Minister Schuman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Our intention is, well, we have to go see what the Mackenzie Valley Impact Review Board has to say first on considering next steps for us. As I said, the bridges are a priority going forward in the next coming year. We believe that's the #1 priority, and we will continue to work with the Mackenzie Valley and Impact Review Board, Indigenous governments, and other stakeholders to figure out how we're going to do Mount Cadet going forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly.
No. Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I guess I want to encourage the minister to sort this out as soon as possible. This isn't the first time I've raised it with him. This is probably the third or fourth time, and there's nothing that has appeared on the review board website about this in the public registry. So maybe there's something happening behind the scenes, but if the department intends to get this work done, they need to sort this out ASAP with the review board. You cannot start work that's within the scope of the environmental assessment. That's the law. So they need to sort this out, and I just encourage the minister to do that as quickly as possible. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Next, I have Mr. McNeely.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I support this appropriation, knowing that you're putting a budget there with the three categories of work, exercise. So I'm satisfied with the numbers and basically just stating my support. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McNeely, for that comment. Next, I have Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So when Minister Schuman talked about, the priorities and that, and so can the Minister of Finance explain to us what the Mount Cadet Access Road, that money is going to be used for? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister MacLeod.
These are substantial.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. The exact details I don't have at my disposal, but I do know that part of it, I think, was for planning, study, and construction of a 15-kilometer all-weather road from Wrigley north to Mount Cadet access road. As for the exact details, I would have to make a commitment to the member that I will have a conversation with infrastructure and be sure we provide those. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank the Minister for the commitment, and no further questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Seeing nothing further from committee, I will call this item Infrastructure Capital Investment Expenditures Asset Management Not Previously Authorized, $4,818,000. Does committee agree? Thank you. Infrastructure Capital Investment Expenditures Total Department Not Previously Authorized, $4,818,000. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. Do you agree that we have concluded consideration of tabled document 255-18 supplementary estimates infrastructure expenditures number 3 2018-2019? Thank you, committee. Thank you to the minister. Thank you to the witnesses. Sergeant at Arms, you may escort the witnesses from the chamber. Mr. Testart.
Mr. Chair, I move the consideration of table document 255-18 supplementary estimates infrastructure expenditures number 3 2018-2019 be now concluded and that table document 255-18 be reported and recommended as ready for further consideration in formal session through the form of an appropriation bill. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. There's a motion on the floor. The motion is in order. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. Committee, we have next agreed to consider tabled document 256-18 supplementary estimate operations expenditures number 3 2018-2019. Once again, I will turn to the Minister of Finance for any opening comments. Minister McLeod.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I'm here to present supplementary estimates operation expenditures number 3 2018-2019. This document provides for an increase of $4.4 million to the operations budget. The major items included in these supplementary estimates are $1.9 million for implementation activities directly related to the legalization and regulation of cannabis. These expenditures will be partially offset by funding from the federal government. $1.2 million for compensation and benefit costs pursuant to the standard physician contract 2016 to 2021, $728,000 to support the delivery of Investing in Canada Infrastructure Plan. These expenditures are fully offset by revenues from the federal government. $389,000 for increased costs related to the Delaunay Self-Government Financing Agreement. That concludes my opening remarks, Mr. Chair, and I would be pleased to answer any questions the members may have. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Do you have witnesses?
Yes, I do, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Sergeant at Arms, please escort the witnesses into the chamber. Minister, please take your seat at the witness table. Minister, would you please introduce your witnesses for the record?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, to my right, I have Mr. David Sturt, who is the Deputy Minister of Finance, and to my left, I have Mr. Sandy Kulruktar, who is the Deputy Secretary to the FMB. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Welcome back to the witnesses. Committee, I will open the floor to general comments. If you have questions about the detail contained within the document, please save it for the appropriate page. General comments, I will begin with Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So of the 4.4 million, how much of that is offset by federal funding? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. $1.85 million. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. What is the impact to the supplemental reserve for operation expenditures after the should this supplementary appropriation pass? Thank you.
Thank you, Minister.
Mr. Chair, we have just under $14 million. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart.
Okay, so Bob, just a point of clarification: is it $14 million currently, or $14 million after the supplementary appropriation? Thank you.
Thank you, Minister.
Yeah, apologies. I should have put in after sub 3, so it's $14 million after sub 3. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. Testart.
Thank you. So after the fiscal year, the supplementary reserve, does it get rolled back into general revenues and used to correct, let's say, deficit in the infrastructure supplementary reserve? Is that the standard practice with these funds? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Stewart.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So I wouldn't characterize it as being rolled back in, but it's expenditures that aren't undertaken, so there would be that much cash left over in terms of the draw on our overall revenue. So it would affect our overall cash position at the end of the year. It would just be that money would be left, and we wouldn't have as large of negative cash position if we had that left over at the end of the year. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Testart.
Thank you. Nothing further.
Thank you. No more further. I see no more general comments. Does committee agree we move into the detail? Thank you, committee. Please turn to page 4. Mr. Van Thyn.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Really, I just want to share a comment that I'm happy to see that the government of Northwest Territories is providing some additional matching dollars here as a contribution on the Northwest Territory from the government of the Northwest Territories towards the Arctic Inspiration Prize. I think this is an organization that does a lot of great work in supporting good concepts, good ideas, and a lot of successful initiatives that we have seen serve the Northwest Territories over the years. And so I'm happy to see that the government of the Northwest Territories continues to make a contribution to the Arctic Inspiration Prize, and most grateful to Arnold Wedzik and his wife, the philanthropic family that started our Arctic Inspiration Prize. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Van Thyn. Executive and Indigenous Affairs, Operations Expenditures, Indigenous and Intergovernmental Affairs, not previously authorized, $50,000. Does committee agree? Thank you. Executive and Indigenous Affairs, Operations Expenditures, Total Department, not previously authorized, $50,000. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. Please turn to page 5. Department of Finance. Seeing no comments or questions, I will call this item. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So looks like there's a number of perhaps communications efforts, positions identified on this page related to cannabis implementation. Can the Minister or staff give us a summary of what this is all about? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Mr. Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So there's three positions related to this activity. Two of them are related to the implementation of cannabis sales and distribution, so they will be involved in the review of any vendor applications that we get to open additional locations. They will also be involved in the overall corporate cannabis-related activities, and then thirdly, to support the future policy changes. The federal government has indicated that there'll be some decisions made around things like edibles, for example, within the year, and that'll require some additional policy work. The second area, the second major area, which is the third position, is around capacity to address workplace-related issues associated with cannabis. So the WSCC has amended the Safety Act around defining and prohibiting impairment at work, and they require then a policy development and guidelines around fit to work that we're in the process of developing now. That position will take on the responsibility of advice and support around that new policy and other labor relations issues associated with cannabis, as well as developing some training materials for managers to help with the implementation of the fit to work policy. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So of the $494,000 that's not previously authorized, how much of this is federal money and how much of it is going to be coming out of the liquor revolving fund, or where does it come from? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Stewart.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. This is through an appropriation as opposed to through the revolving fund, and this is one component where there isn't federal dollars to offset this. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So maybe I'll start. Can the minister or staff tell us what the federal amount is out of the 494, or is that what it's going to cost our government? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Minister?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, that's what it's going to cost our government. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So how is it decided whether an appropriation is used for this, or whether it should come out of the liquor, I guess, and cannabis revolving fund? Are there criteria for those, and can the minister share those with us? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Mr. Stewart.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So the amounts that are being around implementation that are being charged against the revolving fund, I should say, are specific to activities around sales and distribution. So, for example, the e-commerce platform that was developed to sell cannabis online will be dealt with through the revolving fund. These ones are broader type support for issues that are really future policy work in some cases, like the edibles as they come on, as well as the overall coordination of activities. As the member is probably aware, there's other departments that are also engaged in activities related to cannabis in terms of education and community engagement and those sorts of things. So what's going to the revolving fund are the specifics related to the sales and distribution. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly.
Okay, yeah, I'm just trying to figure out how all this is supposed to work, and whether the revenues that are generated from the sales are actually going to cover all of our costs or not. Does the department have any kind of sense of that? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Stewart.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So obviously, we're fairly early into days of the legalization. We've done some estimates around the sort of expected volumes for cannabis sales, and based on the pricing model that was used, we certainly think that it will add to the overall amount that comes back from the revolving fund into general revenues and would be able to cover off these types of expenditures. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly? Nothing further from Mr. O'Reilly. Nothing further from committee. I will call this item. Finance, Operations, Expenditures, Directorate not previously authorized, $147,000. Does committee agree? Finance, Operations, Expenditures, Human Resources not previously authorized, $200,000. Does committee agree? Thank you. Finance, Operations, Expenditures, Management Board Secretariat not previously authorized, $147,000. Does committee agree? Thank you. Finance, Operations, Expenditures, Total Department not previously authorized, $494,000. Does committee agree? Thank you. Committee, please turn to page 6. Health and Social Services. Comments or questions on this $2.5 million ask? Ms. Green?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, under Community Health Programs, I see that there's an expenditure to provide funding for an extension of a grant in kind related to the renewal of the lease with the Young Women's Christian Association for the Rock Hill Apartments. Can the minister give us an update on the status of that grant in kind, given the fact that the building is burned down? Thank you.
6.
Thank you for that question. Ms. Green, could you please hold on to that? We need to take about a 5-minute recess. I will call Committee of the Whole back to order. Sorry about that, committee. A bit of a document mix-up. Ms. Green, would you please ask your question again?
That's a trick question because the page now looks different.
Is there anything further to page 6? Health and Social Services. Mr. Testart.
This is a point of order, Mr. Chair. Could you call the page again with the correct total of the correct total appropriation?
Thank you, Mr. Testart. The page hasn't been called yet, but we are discussing page 6, Health and Social Services, total appropriation of $1.977 million. Ms. Green.
Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, the Government of the Northwest Territories has supported the YWCA with a grant in kind by making the Rock Hill apartment available for the transitional housing program. And it's my understanding that, that this grant in kind has been deleted because the building burned down. Could the Minister confirm that's the case?
Thank you, Ms. Green. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That is correct.
Thank you, Ms. Green.
Thank you. Thank you for that confirmation. I don't really have any further questions on this point. But I have a comment that there will need to be, I think, some help for the YWCA to continue the transitional housing program. But I realize it's not covered in this. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Anything further from committee? Seeing none, I will call this page. Supplementary Estimates, Operations Expenditure number 3, 2018-2019, Health and Social Services Operations Expenditures, Ambulatory Care Services, $457,000. Does committee agree? Sorry, committee, a bit of a wording error. I have to call that again. Health and Social Services Operations Expenditures, Ambulatory Care Services not previously authorized, $457,000. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. Health and Social Services Operations Expenditures, Community Health Programs not previously authorized, $1,520,000. Does committee agree? Thank you. Health and Social Services Operations Expenditures, Total Department not previously authorized, $1,977,000. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. Please turn to page 7. Industry, Tourism, and Investment. Comments or questions? Seeing none, I will call this page. Industry, Tourism, and Investment, Operations Expenditures, Tourism and Parks not previously authorized, $116,000. Does committee agree? Industry, Tourism, and Investment, Operations Expenditures, Total Department not previously authorized, $116,000. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. Please turn to page 8. Infrastructure. Comments or questions? Seeing none, I will call this page. Infrastructure, Operations Expenditures, Corporate Management not previously authorized, $354,000. Does committee agree? Infrastructure, Operations Expenditures, Programs and Services not previously authorized, $272,000. Does committee agree? Infrastructure, Operations Expenditures, Total Department not previously authorized, $626,000. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. Please turn to page 9. Justice. Seeing no comments or questions, I will call this page. Justice, Operations Expenditures, Community Justice and Policing not previously authorized, $75,000. Does committee agree? Justice, Operations Expenditures, Policing Services not previously authorized, $136,000. Does committee agree? Justice, Operations Expenditures, Total Department not previously authorized, $211,000. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. Please turn to the last page of the document. Municipal and Community Affairs. Comments or questions? Seeing none, I'll call the page. Municipal and Community Affairs Operations Expenditures. Community Operations not previously authorized, $313,000. Does committee agree? Municipal and Community Affairs Operations Expenditures Directorate not previously authorized, $200,000. Does committee agree? Thank you. Municipal and Community Affairs Operations Expenditures Regional Operations not previously authorized, $389,000. Does committee agree? Thank you. Municipal and Community Affairs Operations Expenditures Total Department not previously authorized, $902,000. Does committee agree? Thank you. Committee, do you agree that we have concluded consideration of table document 256-18(3) supplementary estimates operations expenditure number 3 2018-2019? Thank you, committee. Thank you to the minister. Thank you to the witnesses. Sergeant at Arms, you may escort the witnesses from the chamber. Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that consideration of table document 256-18(3) supplementary estimates operations expenditures number 3 2018-2019 be now concluded, and that table document 256-18(3) be reported and recommended as ready for further consideration in formal session through the form of an appropriation bill. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. There's a motion on the floor to the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. What is the wish of committee? Mr. Beaulieu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I move that the chair rise and report progress. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Beaulieu. There's a motion to report progress. The motion is in order, non-debatable. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. I will rise and report progress.
May I have the report, Member Hay River North?
Mr. Speaker, your committee has been considering tabled document 255-18 brackets 3 supplementary estimates infrastructure expenditures number 3 2018-2019 and tabled document 256-18 brackets 3 supplementary estimates operations expenditures number 3 2018-2019 and would like to report progress with 2 motions carried and that consideration of tabled documents 255-18 brackets 3 and 256-18 bracket 3 is concluded and that the House concur in those estimates and that an appropriation bill to be based thereon be introduced without delay. And Mr. Speaker, I move that the report of the Committee of the Whole be concurred with.
Massey. Do I have a seconder? Member for Decho. Motions in order. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Massey. Third reading of bills. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move, seconded by the honourable member for Hay River Yellowknife South, that Bill 7, Chartered Professional Accountants Act, be read for the third time. And Mr. Speaker, I would request a recorded vote.
Massey. Member requested for a recorded vote. Motions in order. To the motion. Question's been called. All those in favor, please stand.
The member for Nuvik Twin Lakes, the member for Hay River South, the member for Tabatsha, the member for Hay River North, the member for Mackenzie Delta, the member for Satu, the member for Yellowknife North, the member for Cam Lake, the member for Tunaday Willowday, the member for Nahende, the member for Frame Lake, the member for Yellowknife Center, the member for Decho, the member for Nunaput, the member for Nuvik Boot Lake, the member for Range Lake, the member for Great Slave, the member for Yellowknife South.
All those opposed, please stand. All those abstain, please stand. Massey. The results of the recorded vote, 18 in favor, 0 against, 0 abstention. Motion carried. Massey. Third reading of bills. Third reading of bills. Mr. Clerk, orders of the day.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to advise that the meeting of the Board of Management will resume at Rise of the House in Committee Room A. Orders of the day for Thursday, October 25th, 2018, 1:30 p.m. Prayer, minister statement, member statement, returns to oral questions, recognition of visitors in the gallery, acknowledgments, oral questions, return to written questions, replies to the Commissioner's opening address, petitions, reports of standing and special committees, reports of committees on the review of bills, tabling of documents, notices of motion, notice of motion for the first reading of bills, motion, first reading of bills, Bill 24, second reading of bills, consideration in Committee of the Whole of bills and other matters, Minister Statement 19-18 bracket 3, Minister Statement 103-18 bracket 3, Table Document 215-18-3, Report of Committee of the Whole, third reading of bills, orders of the day.
Mr. Clerk, this House stands adjourned until Thursday, October 25th at 1:30 p.m.
Order.